18 years old, and she was already being sold. Not her labor, not her time. Her. Standing in the dirt in front of half a town that refused to meet her eyes, Eliza Hartwell understood something with cold, terrible clarity. The people who should have saved her had already looked away. Her own brother had set the price. The mining boss had counted out the coins, and every man in Black Ridge had found something very interesting to stare at in the middle distance while it happened. Every man except one. Press like, and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The summer that broke Black Ridge open started, like most disasters, with a man who thought he was smarter than he was. Dorian Hartwell was 26 years old and had never once in his life woken before noon unless money was involved. He was tall in the way that sometimes gets mistaken for dignified, with their father's jaw and their mother's restless hands. And he had inherited exactly nothing else from either of them, except a talent for wanting things he hadn't earned. He could charm a room, he could read a table, he could look a man in the eye and make that man feel, for 30 seconds or so, that Dorian Hartwell was someone worth trusting. 30 seconds was usually long enough. The trouble with Black Ridge was that it was a mining town, and mining towns attracted a particular kind of man. The kind who'd crossed 2 mountain ranges to get somewhere, who'd buried friends along the way, who didn't have much patience left for charm. The gambling tables at the Copper Spur Saloon were run by men who'd seen every trick Dorian had ever tried, and a few he hadn't thought of yet. By the time April rolled in off the high desert, Dorian owed money to 6 different creditors, and the kind of interest that didn't wait. Eliza knew about the debts the way she knew about most things in her brother's life, sideways, in pieces, by accident. A crumpled letter left on the kitchen table. A conversation cut short when she walked in from the well. The way Dorian wouldn't quite look at her some mornings, his eyes sliding past her face to settle on the wall behind her head. She'd been keeping the house since their mother died 3 years back. That was just how it was. She cooked and mended and hauled water and kept a kitchen garden behind the small claim shack they called home on the east side of town, the unfashionable side. The side where the dust blew in off the flats and settled on everything you owned. She'd taught herself to stretch a dollar so thin you could read through it. She didn't complain, mostly because there wasn't anyone to complain to. Their father had gone into the mine 8 years ago and hadn't come out. That happened sometimes. Nobody in Black Ridge talked about it much. The morning everything changed, Eliza was up before dawn working bread dough when Dorian came in through the back door, still wearing his coat from the night before. He smelled like whiskey and cigarette smoke and something underneath that she couldn't name, something close to fear. "Sit down," he said. "I'm in the middle of Sit down, Eliza." She set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him. Really looked. His face was gray under the tan, and there was something happening around his mouth, a tightness that she'd seen before when he'd lost badly, but worse now. Worse than she'd seen it. She sat. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned his hat in his hands and stared at the floor and said, "I've made arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that solve a problem." He still wasn't looking at her. "Harlan Cross he's offered to take you on at the processing facility. You'd be working for him." Eliza knew who Harlan Cross was. Everyone in Black Ridge knew who Harlan Cross was. He owned 3 of the 6 producing mines in the valley, the processing operation out on the North Road, and roughly half the town's debt. He was 50 years old and built like a draft horse gone to fat, and he had a way of standing in a room that made the room feel smaller. She had seen him twice, maybe 3 times, and both times she had stepped to the other side of the street without quite deciding to. "Working for him how?" she said. Dorian's hands went still on the hat. "House management, cooking, whatever he needs." The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside and the low tick of the stove. Eliza looked at her brother, at the back of his neck, because he still wouldn't face her. And she felt something settle into place in her chest, cold and certain, the way a stone settles into mud. "Whatever he needs," she repeated. "It's a good situation. You'd have how much?" The silence stretched. A coal shifted in the stove. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse shook its head and jingled its bit. "Dorian," her voice came out flat. How much did you get for me? He turned around then. She almost wished he hadn't, because she could see it on his face. Not shame, exactly. Something worse than shame. Something that had already moved past the part where shame would have lived and settled into the place where a man tells himself he had no choice. Enough to clear the worst of it, he said. Eliza, I had no... Get out of my kitchen. You don't understand. Cross's men, they came to the house 2 nights ago. They said if I didn't... Get out. He left. The door banged behind him. Eliza sat at the table for a long time with her hands flat on the wood and her bread dough slowly going cold on the counter, and she thought about what it meant to have no options at all, and she thought about her mother's face, and she thought about her father's boots sitting by the door for 3 months after he died because neither of them could bring themselves to move them. Then she got up and punched the bread dough down and let it rest and started planning. She had 4 days. That was how long it took for Dorian to work up the nerve, or maybe for Cross's men to lose patience. She wasn't sure which, and it didn't matter much. 4 days during which she moved through her regular routines with a kind of rigid, deliberate calm, because the alternative was coming apart, and coming apart in Black Ridge was something she couldn't afford. She went to the general store and asked old Prentice, the owner, whether he knew of any work available for a woman with cooking and sewing skills. He looked at her over his glasses and said he'd ask around, meaning he wouldn't. She went to the sheriff's office, a thing she'd never done in her life, and told Deputy Walcott what her brother had done, choosing her words carefully, keeping her hands still in her lap. Walcott listened with his elbows on his desk and the expression of a man hearing something he would very much prefer not to hear, and then he said that family financial arrangements were generally considered a private matter, and that he hoped she and her brother could work things out between them. "It's not a family financial arrangement," she said. "It's a sale." Miss Hartwell. He picked up a pen, looked at his desk, put the pen down. Harlan Cross employs better than 60 men in this valley. His taxes pay for this office, my salary, the school your neighbor's children attend. I understand this is difficult, but there's very little I can... She left before he finished the sentence. She went to the minister, though she wasn't particularly devout, and he expressed deep sympathy and offered prayer, and suggested that perhaps her brother might be made to see reason. She went to Mrs. Calloway, who ran the boarding house, and was generally considered to be the most influential woman in town. Mrs. Calloway poured her tea and said, carefully, that it was a terrible shame, just terrible, and that some men had no sense of family feeling at all, and that if things became truly desperate, Eliza might find a room available, though of course she'd need to be able to pay. On the 4th day, Harlan Cross came to collect what he'd bought. He came at 9 in the morning, which was almost an insult. Broad daylight, Main Street. The town going about its business around him like this was nothing, like this was just another transaction. He brought 2 men with him, not because he needed them, but because he liked having witnesses to his authority. He was wearing a good coat despite the heat, and he had a cigar going, and he walked up to the front of the Hartwell place and knocked on the door with the butt of a riding crop. Dorian answered. Of course Dorian answered. He'd been waiting. Eliza was standing in the front room when the door opened, and she had her traveling bag packed and sitting at her feet, because she had decided 3 days ago that she would walk out of her own door rather than be dragged. That was the only choice she had left, and she was going to make it mean something, even if the meaning was only visible to herself. Cross looked her over the way you'd look over a horse you were thinking about buying. Not unkindly, exactly. He wasn't a man who wasted energy on cruelty unless it was useful, but with a flat, assessing quality that made her skin prickle. "She'll do," he said, to Dorian, not to her. "Where's the rest of it?" "That's everything she owns," Dorian said. There was a crack in his voice that she suspected was meant to sound like regret, and landed somewhere short of it. "Fine." Cross jerked his chin at one of the men behind him. "Take the bag." The man stepped forward. Eliza's hand tightened on the bag's handle. She looked at her brother, one last look, direct, unblinking. And Dorian looked away first. He always did. She let go of the bag. She walked through the door. She did not look back at the house. Out on the street, a few people had stopped. Not many. 8, maybe 10. A man loading barrels outside the dry goods store. 2 women who'd been talking on the corner of Main and 2nd and had gone quiet. Young Tom Garvey from the livery, who was 16 and had the grace to look mortified. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. Cross put a hand on her elbow to steer her north toward the road. His grip wasn't rough, just definitive, the grip of a man accustomed to things going where he pointed them. Eliza walked. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she thought about nothing, deliberately nothing, because thinking about something would mean feeling it, and she could not feel it yet. They were 4 steps past the edge of the Hartwell property when the sound of a horse came down the street from the south. Not fast, not dramatic, just a big gray horse moving at an unhurried walk, rider loose in the saddle, like a man who had nowhere urgent to be and had arranged his life to keep it that way. The horse was road-dirty, trail-worn, and the man on it was roughly the same, dust on his coat, several days of beard, a hat that had seen better years. He looked about 30, maybe a touch past it, with the kind of face that had been exposed to enough weather that it was hard to read anything in it except a general quality of attention. He wasn't looking at Cross. He was looking at Eliza. Cross's arm tightened on her elbow, a reflexive thing. "Keep walking," he said. The rider pulled up. Not in front of them, not blocking the road, just stopped, there in the street, one hand easy on the pommel, watching. The gray horse dropped its head to sniff at a wagon rut. "Something I can help you with, friend?" Cross asked. The word friend landed the way he intended it, which was not friendly at all. The rider looked from Eliza to Cross to the 2 men behind them. His expression didn't change. He had dark eyes that moved carefully and settled slowly, and there was something in the way he sat his horse that Eliza recognized, though she couldn't have named it right then. She would later, looking back, as the posture of a man who had been in enough trouble to stop being afraid of it. "Who's the girl?" the rider said. "None of your business," Cross said. "She look willing to you?" The street had gone quiet. Even the barrel-loading man had stopped. Eliza could feel the attention of those 8 or 10 bystanders shifting, sharpening, the particular alertness of people watching something they're not sure whether to run from yet. Cross turned to face the rider more fully. His 2 men spread out slightly, the way men do when they're used to backing a play. "I'd advise you to ride on," Cross said. The rider looked at Eliza again. Not a long look. A few seconds, maybe. But there was something in it that was different from the way every other person in this town had looked at her since this started. Different from Walcott's avoidance and Mrs. Calloway's careful sympathy and the bystanders' anxious fascination. He was looking at her like she was a person, like the question he was actually asking was one only she could answer. She didn't know why she did what she did next. Later she'd tell herself it was desperation, pure animal instinct, the last throw of someone with nothing left to lose. But the truth was probably simpler. He was the first person who had looked at her and waited to see what she'd do. She stopped walking, just planted her feet, right there in the dirt of Black Ridge's main street, and stopped. Cross's grip on her arm yanked tight. "I said, 'Let go of my arm,'" she said. The words came out steady. She didn't plan them. They were just there. Cross looked at her. Then he looked at the rider. Then back at her. His jaw tightened. Not anger yet. More like recalculation. The expression of a man who'd planned for a number of outcomes and was currently running through which one this was. The rider stepped down off his horse. He didn't reach for the gun at his hip. He didn't say anything. He just got down and looped his reins around a hitching post with the ease of long habit and walked toward them, and there was something in the way he moved that made Cross's 2 men exchange a look. "Maddox," one of them said quietly. The other one took a small step back, just a small one. Cross heard the name land. Something shifted in his face, a subtle tightening, though he kept his expression flat. "Colt Maddox," he said. You've got no stake in this." "Maybe not." Maddox stopped about 6 feet away. Close enough to talk, far enough to see everything. "I'm trying to figure out if the young woman is here by choice. This is a private arrangement between—" "I'm not asking you," Maddox said. He looked at Eliza. "I'm asking her." Every person on that street was looking at her now. She could feel them. The barrel man, the 2 women, young Tom Garvey, the handful of others who'd drifted to doorways and windows as word moved the way word always moves in small towns, which is to say instantly and without anyone quite intending it. She looked at Colt Maddox. He was not particularly large, not particularly imposing. He was dusty and tired, and he needed a shave, and his coat had been mended at one shoulder with slightly mismatched thread. He looked, in other words, like a man who'd been on the road a long time, which was the opposite of impressive. But he was asking her a question, out loud, in public, in front of witnesses. He was making her answer matter. "No," she said, "I'm not here by choice." Cross made a sound low in his throat. His hand was still on her arm, grip unchanged. "This is a legal arrangement," he said, loud enough for the street to hear. "Debt settlement between a creditor and—" "Debt settlement," Maddox said. "That's what you're calling it." "That's what it is." "Uh-huh." Maddox looked around the street, the bystanders, the storefronts, the deputy's office with its door notably closed, then back at Cross. "You've got a bill of sale?" "I have documentation, yes, if you think you have any authority to—" "Let me see it." "You don't have any right. You're holding a woman by the arm in the middle of a public street and telling me she's your property." Maddox's voice stayed even, no heat in it. That was what made it effective. The complete absence of heat, like the statement was just a simple fact he was clearing up. "I'd like to see the paper that says that's legal, because I've ridden through 7 territories in the last 4 years, and I haven't been in one yet where that paper exists." One of Cross's men put a hand on his gun. Maddox didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Cross, but his right hand moved just slightly, dropping lower at his side. Young Tom Garvey, on the sidewalk, took a step backward and disappeared into the livery doorway. The barrel man set down his barrel and didn't pick it back up. The 2 women on the corner had not moved, Eliza noticed. One of them was watching Maddox, the other one was watching her. Cross released her arm. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the kind of thing a man does when he's deciding that the current situation represents a tactical withdrawal rather than a defeat. He straightened his coat, took a pull on his cigar, which had gone mostly out, looked at Maddox with the expression of a man filing something away. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Whatever you think this is, I think it's a woman standing on a public street who says she doesn't want to go with you," Maddox said. "That's what I think it is. If I'm wrong about what that means, you can take it up with the court." Cross looked at Eliza one more time, then at Maddox. His 2 men were still there, still positioned, waiting for a signal that hadn't come. He could push this. She could see him calculating it, weighing the variables with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd made these calculations many times before. He didn't push it. Not here, not in the open. "We'll speak again, Maddox," Cross said. "Probably," Maddox agreed. Cross turned and walked north up the street, the same direction he'd been heading, unhurried, his 2 men falling in behind him. He didn't look back. He was the kind of man who didn't need to. Eliza stood in the middle of the street and watched him go. Her arm, where his hand had been, felt strange, too light somehow, like something that had been pressing down on it for longer than the last few minutes. Maddox came to stand beside her. Not close, just there. "You got somewhere you can go?" he asked. She thought about the boarding house and Mrs. Calloway's careful sympathy and the room that would need paying for. She thought about Deputy Walcott's pen and the closed door. She thought about Dorian somewhere behind her, in the house that was going to stop being their house as soon as Cross's men circled back around. "Not particularly," she said. Maddox nodded, like this was the kind of answer he'd been expecting. He walked back to his horse and untied the reins. "There's a camp about 2 miles east, up in the junipers. Decent water, hard to find if you don't know it." He gathered the reins without looking at her. "Nobody would look for you there tonight." "Why would you—" She stopped herself, started again. "You don't know me." "No." He checked the cinch on the saddle, found it satisfactory, left it alone. "But you're the first person in this town who's told the truth out loud in the last 5 minutes. I've got a soft spot for that." He didn't wait for her answer. He stepped up into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, touched his hat brim in the vague direction of the remaining bystanders, and rode east at the same unhurried walk he'd arrived at. Eliza picked up her traveling bag, which one of Cross's men had dropped in the street when Maddox had stepped down from his horse. She checked that nothing had spilled. She straightened up. The barrel man was back at his barrels. The 2 women were resuming their conversation. Tom Garvey had reappeared in the livery doorway, watching her with wide eyes and the expression of someone who had just witnessed something he wasn't sure he believed. She looked at him. "You going to say something, Tom?" He opened his mouth, closed it, shook his head. "Good," she said. She walked east. She found the camp because she followed the sound of the water, which was a thin creek coming down off the high ground, cutting through a fold of land that hid itself until you were almost on top of it. The junipers were old growth out here, thick-trunked and shade-dense, and the smell of them was sharp and clean after the coal smoke and horse dung of the town. Maddox had a fire going by the time she arrived, small and efficient, the kind made by someone who knew how to have heat without having a signal. His horse was hobbled on the creek grass. He had a coffee pot on, and he was sitting on a rock cleaning the action of his rifle with the focused patience of a man who maintained things, because failing to maintain them had consequences. He looked up when she came through the trees, then back at the rifle. "Coffee'll be ready in a bit," he said. She set her bag down and sat on a fallen trunk across the fire from him. For a while, neither of them said anything. The creek talked to itself, and the fire made its small sounds, and somewhere high up, a pair of ravens had an argument. "You're going to tell me you can't stay," he said eventually, without looking up from the rifle. "I can't stay," she said. "Because he'll come back. Because he'll come back, and because I can't spend the rest of my life hiding in the junipers, and because—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on her knees. "Because my brother is still in that house, and he knows things about how Cross operates, and I think if I could get him to talk—" Maddox set the rifle across his knees and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived. He had a smudge of gun oil on his left hand, and he'd pushed his hat back on his head, and he looked tired in a way that had less to do with the current day and more to do with a number of previous ones. "Your brother," he said carefully, "is the man who sold you." "I know what my brother is." She met his eyes. "I'm not looking for him to apologize. I need him to be useful." Maddox was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across his face that might, if you were being generous, have been the beginning of respect. "You been to the sheriff?" he asked. "Deputy Walcott." "Yes." "And?" "Harlan Cross's taxes pay for his salary." "Right." He turned the rifle over, checked to the other side, set it down on the rock beside him. "I've been through 5 towns like this one in the last 3 years. Mining towns, timber towns, cattle towns. It's always the same machinery. One man with enough money that the law works for him instead of for the people. And the people—" He paused, looking at the fire. "Most of them aren't bad. They just got families to feed, and they know what happened to the last person who made trouble." "So they look at the wall," Eliza said. "They look at the wall." He picked up the coffee pot and poured 2 tin cups without asking if she wanted any. "The thing that's different here is the scale of it. Cross isn't just running muscle. I heard things riding in. A man in a saloon who'd had 3 drinks too many talking about ledgers, books that Cross keeps, accounts of who owes what and who he's taken on and under what terms." He handed her a cup. "That kind of documentation means there's more to this than your situation." She held the cup in both hands and let the warmth go up through her palms. "How much more?" "I don't know yet." He picked up his own cup and looked at her over the rim. "But I'd like to find out." "Why?" The question sat between them. It was a fair question. He was a man she'd met 3 hours ago who'd stepped into a situation that was none of his concern at considerable personal risk, and who was now offering to make it more so. People, in her experience, didn't do that without a reason. Maddox seemed to consider the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect, and he didn't give her a speech. "I had a sister," he said. "She's fine now, but she wasn't, for a while, and the men who were supposed to help her found reasons not to." He set down the cup. "I've been carrying that around long enough that I might as well do something with it." She thought about her father's boots by the door, about the specific weight of things you keep carrying because setting them down feels like abandoning something. "I need to understand what Cross actually has on my brother," she said. "If Dorian's going to be useful, I need to know how deep he's in, and I need to know if there are other people in the same situation, working for Cross under the same kind of arrangement." "There are others," Maddox said. It wasn't a guess. She looked at him. Man in the saloon I mentioned, he said. He wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about his sister-in-law. There's a family up on Cutter Creek, the Wares. 3 of them working Cross's North processing facility under circumstances that sound a lot like yours. And those are just the ones that come up in conversation when a stranger buys around. He paused. The ones who don't come up. That's the part that worries me. Eliza drank her coffee. It was bad, burnt, and too strong, and it was, right now, one of the best things she'd ever tasted. I can get into the records office, she said. I used to do mending for the county clerk's wife, Mrs. Hale. She's not a bad woman. She's afraid, but she's not a bad woman. And she owes me $3 for a set of curtains I never collected on. The records office keeps property transfer records, Maddox said slowly, and employment contracts, and debt instruments, if they're properly registered. She looked at him. Harlan Cross is a careful man. A man like that registers his paperwork. He would want it legal. He would want it so legal that nobody could argue it. Until someone actually reads it. Until someone actually reads it, she agreed. The fire had settled down to a steady burn. The ravens had stopped arguing. Somewhere on the creek, a night heron gave its ugly, prehistoric call once and went silent. You have a plan, Maddox said. Not quite a question. I have the beginning of one. She set down her cup. The beginning needs a few things I don't have. Like? Someone who can ride fast and isn't known in town. Someone Cross's men won't look at twice. She glanced at his horse, hobbled contentedly on the creek grass. And someone who can sit across a table from Dorian Hartwell without losing their patience in the first 3 minutes. Maddox looked at her for a long moment. That last one might be asking a lot. Everything worth doing is asking a lot, she said. That's been my experience. He picked up his rifle again, not to clean it, just to have something in his hands, looked at it, set it back down. First thing in the morning, he said. Your brother first, then the records office. And Cross? Cross is going to know you didn't go quietly. He's going to be making plans. He looked at the fire. So we'd better make better ones. She nodded once. The fire settled. The creek ran on. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay on her blanket with her eyes at the dark gap between the juniper branches and the sky, watching the stars turn their slow wheel, and she thought about all the ways the next few days could go wrong. And she was afraid, genuinely afraid, in the way you can only be afraid when you've stopped lying to yourself about the odds. But underneath the fear there was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe not since before her father went into the mine and didn't come back. Maybe not since before she'd understood what her life in this town was really going to be. It wasn't hope, exactly. She was too practical for hope. It was more like the feeling you get when you stop waiting for someone else to do something. The particular, terrible, bracing clarity of knowing that the only hands available are yours. She was going to need them. Dorian was still in the house when they got there the next morning, which surprised her. She'd half expected him to have run. That was Dorian's natural response to consequences, getting distance between himself and whatever he'd done. But he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the specific stillness of a man who has nowhere left to run to. He looked up when the door opened. When he saw Maddox behind her, something moved across his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite shame. It landed somewhere between them, which was probably the most honest thing about him. Eliza, he started. Don't. She set her bag down by the door. She didn't sit. I'm not here for an apology, so save the breath. I need to know everything about your arrangement with Cross. Every detail. What you signed, what you promised, what he has on you. Dorian looked at Maddox. Who's this? Someone with considerably less patience for you than I have, she said. Talk. For a moment she thought he was going to refuse, or deflect, or do the thing he always did when cornered, which was find a way to make whatever had happened someone else's fault. She watched him consider it, and then, slowly, like something draining out of him, abandon it. He talked. It took the better part of an hour. The debt had started 8 months ago, a bad run at the copper spur tables that he'd tried to dig out of with bigger bets and a borrowed stake from one of Cross's men. The kind of loan that came with terms nobody explained clearly until the interest had already compounded past anything manageable. When Dorian couldn't pay, a man named Sutter, Cross's main enforcer, quiet-spoken and deliberate in the way that's more frightening than loud, had come to the house and laid out the options. There were two of them. Neither involved Dorian keeping his teeth. He said a girl who could cook and keep house was worth $400 against the debt, Dorian said. He was looking at the table when he said it. Said it like it was nothing, like he was talking about a piece of furniture. And you said yes, Eliza said. I said I needed to think about it. And then you said yes. He didn't answer. Which was an answer. Maddox had been leaning against the wall near the door, quiet until now. How many others? He said. Dorian looked up. What? Other families. Other debts settled the same way. How many did you hear about while you were running up your own tab at Cross's tables? Something shifted in Dorian's expression, a recognition that this conversation was larger than his particular situation. He wet his lips. There was talk. You hear things at the Copper Spur if you're in there enough nights. The Ware family up on Cutter Creek, the father owes Cross for mining equipment he never actually received. Man named Pollard on the South Road, his wife and daughter both working the processing facility. He paused. There were others. I don't know the names. The ledgers, Eliza said. Dorian frowned. What about them? Cross keeps books, records of the arrangements. She looked at him steadily. Where does he keep them? Eliza, if he finds out I told you, he's going to find out regardless. The question is whether you're on the right side of this when it matters. She leaned forward on the table, both palms flat. Where, Dorian? He told her. The ledgers were kept in a locked office at the main processing facility, North Road, under the care of Cross's bookkeeper, a small, nervous man named Abilene, who slept in the back room of the facility office and was, by Dorian's description, absolutely terrified of his employer and just barely smart enough to know why. He might talk, Dorian said slowly. Abilene, if he thought there was a way out. He's been in there 2 years and he looks like a man counting down something. Or he might run straight to Cross, Maddox said. Yeah, Dorian admitted. He might do that too. They left Dorian in the kitchen with instructions to stay put and stay quiet, neither of which Eliza expected him to follow perfectly, but there wasn't much to be done about that. People were who they were. You worked with what you had. Outside, walking back through the east side streets, Maddox fell in beside her. The morning was already heating up. Midsummer, high desert, the sun had opinions. And the town was going about its business with the cultivated normalcy of a place that had decided yesterday hadn't really happened. Records office first, she said. Then we decide about Abilene. Mrs. Hale, he said, remembering. Mrs. Hale. The county records office occupied the back half of a building that also housed the post office and a surveyor's operation that nobody seemed to use. Margaret Hale had been the county clerk's wife for 19 years, and she was the kind of woman whose competence went largely unremarked because she was careful about where she deployed it. She had brown hair going to gray and very good posture, and she looked at Eliza, and then at Maddox, and then back at Eliza with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating. The whole town is talking about yesterday, she said quietly, once she'd brought them into the back room and closed the door. She didn't sound scandalized. She sounded tired. I imagine so, Eliza said. Harlan Cross sent a man to speak with my husband this morning. She folded her hands on the desk. My husband told me about it afterward. He didn't tell Cross's man anything, but... She pressed her lips together. He's frightened. My husband is a good man, Eliza, but he's frightened. I know. I'm not asking him for anything. Eliza looked at her. I'm asking you. Margaret Hale was quiet for a long moment. Outside the closed door, the muffled sounds of the post office, someone's boots, a package being set down. The debt instruments, she said finally. You want to see what's been registered. I need to know the scope of it. How many people, how long it's been running, whether the contracts cross-filed are actually enforceable, or whether they're paper that only looks legal. They're paper that only looks legal, Margaret said flatly. I've been looking at documents in this office for 19 years. Those contracts... She stopped herself, smoothed her skirt, started again, more carefully. I noticed perhaps 8 months ago that several filings from Harlan Cross's business interests were structured in a way that I hadn't seen before. Debt instruments that named persons as collateral rather than property or labor. I flagged it for my husband. She looked at her hands. He said the language was unusual but not necessarily unlawful, and we should leave it to the courts to decide. And you left it, Eliza said. Not accusing, just placing the fact down. I left it, Margaret said. She looked up. I am not leaving it now. She had the files pulled within 20 minutes. They spread them across the backroom desk, and what they found was worse than Eliza had expected and exactly as bad as Maddox had seemed to anticipate, which told her something about the kind of towns he'd been through. 31 separate debt instruments over 14 months. 31 families, or close enough. Some were individual names, some listed husband and wife together. The amounts varied. The structure was identical. Each contract included a clause buried in the third or fourth page of small print that allowed Cross's operation to claim labor and services of any member of the debtor's household as satisfaction of debt at a rate set exclusively by the creditor, meaning Cross decided what the labor was worth and how long it lasted. There was no end date on most of them. There was no mechanism for dispute. This is not legal, Maddox said. He wasn't a lawyer, but he said it with the certainty of someone who'd seen enough legal documents to know what they weren't. No, Margaret agreed, but it's registered, which means it has the appearance of legitimacy, and most of these people wouldn't have the resources to challenge it in court, even if they knew they could. So they just work. Eliza was looking at the names. Some she recognized. The Wares. A family named Beaumont she'd seen at the dry goods store occasionally, a woman and 2 teenage sons, a man named Rourke who she knew by sight from the mill. 31 entries. 31 situations like hers. How many of them know they're not legally bound? None of them, Margaret said. That would be my guess. Cross's men are very careful about what they explain and what they don't. Eliza looked up at Maddox. He was already looking at her. We need copies, she said. I can make copies, Margaret said. It'll take me until this afternoon. And we need someone from the territorial government, Maddox said. Not the local sheriff. Someone from outside. A circuit judge. A marshal. Someone Cross doesn't have a tab with. Nearest circuit judge is in Harmon Springs, Margaret said. 3 days' ride. I can make it in 2, Maddox said. Eliza looked at him. You'd go. Someone has to. He said it plainly, no particular drama in it. You can't go. Cross's men will be watching the roads out of town. I'm already marked, so it doesn't matter much. He paused. But I'm not going to ride out of here until I know you're not going to be scooped up the minute I'm gone. I won't hide, she said. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you not to get grabbed before we have something to show a judge. She thought about that. The Beaumont woman. From the filing. She tapped the name on the document. I think I know where she lives, and the Wares on Cutter Creek. Dorian said the father might talk. So you're going to go collect people, Maddox said. I'm going to go talk to them. There's a difference. She straightened up from the desk. If they know what Cross filed, if they see their own names on those documents, some of them are going to be angry. Angry people who know the same thing happened to their neighbor tend to start talking to each other. And Cross finds out you're organizing? Maddox said carefully. Yes. And then things get considerably more dangerous. Yes, she said again. That's how it usually works, isn't it? He didn't argue with her, which she was coming to understand was its own kind of statement from him. What happened next did not go the way she'd imagined, because nothing in the next 48 hours went the way anyone imagined, except possibly Harlan Cross, who was moving his own pieces with the methodical patience of a man who had played this kind of game before and won it. The first indication came that afternoon when she went to find the Beaumont woman, Clara Beaumont, the document said, age 38, and found her house already shut up. Curtains drawn, door locked, the cold ash of a recently cleared hearth visible through the front window. A neighbor woman across the lane told Eliza, with the tight expression of someone choosing words carefully, that the Beaumont family had left to visit relatives that morning, very suddenly, with 2 of Cross's men helping them load their wagon. They hadn't come back. The Wares on Cutter Creek were still there, but barely. James Ware came to the door looking like a man who hadn't slept in several days, which turned out to be accurate. He let Eliza in when she explained who she was, and let Maddox in with visible reluctance, and then stood in the middle of his own kitchen with his arms crossed over his chest, and told them that Sutter had been out the previous evening, just to check in, just to make sure everything was comfortable, just to mention, in passing, that the road out of Cutter Creek was in poor condition this time of year, and it would be a shame if anyone had to travel it in a hurry. "He knows you're talking to people," James Ware said. He was about 50, lean and weathered, with a bad shoulder that sat crooked under his shirt. "He always knows." "What he doesn't know," Eliza said, "is that his contracts are already copied and waiting, or that there's a rider leaving for Harmon Springs tomorrow." Ware looked at Maddox. "You?" "Me," Maddox said. "And you think a circuit judge is going to ride out here for a bunch of mining company labor disputes?" "I think when a circuit judge sees 31 registered contracts that attempt to use human beings as debt collateral, he's going to have strong professional feelings about it," Maddox said. "That's been my experience with judges." "Your experience?" Ware's voice was flat. "With respect, mister, the last time I trusted someone's experience with the law, I ended up signing a piece of paper that put my son to work in Cross's mill for $4 a month when his contracted wage was 14. The kitchen was quiet. Maddox didn't say anything for a moment. "I know," he said finally. "I know it's not a good reason to trust me. I can't give you a better one right now." He looked at the older man steadily. "But I'm going either way. What you do with that is yours to decide." Ware looked at him, looked at Eliza. Something moved in his face, the particular expression of a man weighing the risk of hope against the cost of it. "My son gets off shift at the mill at 6, he said. "He'd want to know what's happening." "Tell him," Eliza said. The thing that Cross didn't account for, or perhaps misjudged, was the math of shared misery. The Wares told the Rourkes, who were 2 farms over. The Rourkes had a sister-in-law whose husband was one of the 31 names on Margaret Hale's documents. Word moved the way word moved in small communities, which was sideways and underground, through the channels Cross's men weren't watching because they didn't know they existed. By the time the sun went down that day, 7 families had made contact with Eliza, some directly, some through intermediaries. Not all of them were willing to do anything. Some of them, like James Ware, were weighing odds and not yet ready to commit to which side of them they landed on. But they were listening. And the ones who were listening were telling each other things that Cross's management of information had previously prevented. That their situation wasn't unique, that what had happened to them had happened to their neighbor too, and their neighbor's neighbor. That the whole structure they'd been told was legal and individual, and their own particular fault was in fact a machine, and there were 30 other people caught in the same gears. Anger, it turned out, was easier to sustain when you weren't alone in it. Maddox left before dawn the next morning. She walked with him to where he'd picketed the gray horse, at the edge of the creek flat east of town, away from any road where Cross's men might be watching. 2 days to Harmon Springs, she said. 2 days back. Give me 3, either way, to account for the judge needing convincing. He was checking his saddlebags, tightening the picket line before he undid it. You said you could stay with Margaret Hale. She offered. Stay inside as much as you can. Don't let them catch you somewhere with no witnesses. Maddox. She waited until he looked at her. I know how to be careful. I know you do. He didn't look away. I also know that careful isn't always enough, and I'd feel better about leaving if I thought you'd run if it came to it. I won't. He looked at her for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light, and she could see him deciding not to push it further, which was the right decision. She wasn't going to run. He knew it, and she knew it, and further discussion would only waste time. The copies, he said. You have them somewhere safe? Margaret has 1 set. I have another. Dorian... She paused. I gave Dorian a set. Something flickered in Maddox's expression. That's a risk. He's my brother. She said it without warmth and without apology. He's not brave and he's not reliable, and he made a choice I can't entirely forgive. But he's not Cross's man. He's just a man who made a terrible decision because he was scared, and now he's scared in a different direction. She looked out toward the creek. That's actually useful. Maddox made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and dry, and untied the gray from the picket. He was up in the saddle and turning east when he paused and looked back at her. For what it's worth, he said, you're the most clear-headed person I've met in a long time. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she just said, come back with the judge. Working on it, he said, and rode into the dark. She stood there for a while after the sound of the hooves faded. The creek moved in the dark below her, and somewhere in the direction of town a rooster was working through its complaints, and the stars overhead were fading at the edges where the sky was beginning to know about morning. She had 4 days, maybe 5, before Maddox could return. Cross knew she was talking to people. Sutter was watching the roads. The 7 families who'd made contact were frightened and not yet committed, and the Beaumont woman was gone to somewhere that felt like a warning. She was one person with a stack of copied documents, a brother of questionable reliability, and the goodwill of a county clerk's wife whose husband was terrified. It wasn't much. She turned and walked back toward town. The rooster kept going. The sky kept lightening. She had work to do. The next 3 days were the longest of Eliza's life, and not because nothing happened, because too much happened, and none of it was in her control, and she had to keep moving anyway. Cross made his first real move on the second morning. She was at Margaret Hale's kitchen table going over the copied documents with James Ware's son, a 22-year-old named Cal, who'd turned out to be sharper than his father and considerably angrier when they heard boots on the front porch and then a knock that was really more of a statement. Margaret answered it. Through the partially open kitchen door, Eliza could see 2 of Cross's men, not Sutter, the second-tier ones, the kind he sent when he wanted to deliver a message without quite delivering a threat. Mr. Cross would like to speak with Miss Hartwell, the taller one said. At her convenience. Miss Hartwell is not available at present, Margaret said. Ma'am, he'd really prefer— I'm sure he would. Margaret's voice was pleasant and entirely immovable, the voice of a woman who had been managing difficult men from behind a veneer of cordiality for 19 years and had it down to an art form. I'll pass along the message. Good day. She closed the door. She came back to the kitchen. She sat down at the table and picked up her tea and said, We have perhaps until this evening before he sends Sutter. Then we need to move, Eliza said. Move where? Cal asked. She'd been thinking about that. The documents were already distributed, 3 copies in 3 locations, one of which Margaret didn't even know about, because Eliza had decided that the safest information was information nobody fully controlled. But documents alone weren't enough. What she needed was people willing to stand up and say, in front of a judge and a public record, that yes, this is what happened to me, yes, I signed this under duress, yes, I want it challenged. Pieces of paper were evidence. People were witnesses. She needed both. I need to get to the workplace, she said, and I need to talk to Abilene. Cal looked up sharply. Cross's bookkeeper? Your father said he might talk. My father also said he might run straight to Cross. I know. She folded the documents carefully and tucked them into her jacket. That's why I need to get to him before Sutter decides to move him somewhere I can't. What she didn't say, and didn't need to say, was that time was running the wrong direction. Maddox had been gone 2 days. Even if everything had gone perfectly in Harmon Springs, and she had no reason to assume anything had gone perfectly, he was 1 day out at best. She was alone in a town where Cross owned the sheriff's budget, the mayor's goodwill, and the livelihood of most of the working men, and she was trying to dismantle something that had been built carefully over 14 months. She was also, she realized with a clarity that was almost funny, no longer particularly afraid. She'd been afraid the first night in the Junipers, and afraid walking into her brother's kitchen, and afraid at moments since. But somewhere in the last 48 hours, the fear had been crowded out by the sheer volume of things that needed doing, and what was left underneath it was something closer to fury, a clean, useful, focused fury that she intended to spend wisely. She left Margaret's house through the back garden. Abilene was a small man in his middle 40s who looked like he'd been left out in weather that was slightly too harsh for him, faded, slightly damp around the edges, with the posture of someone who'd spent years trying to take up as little space as possible. He answered Eliza's knock at the back door of the processing facility office with the expression of a man who had been expecting for some time, a knock exactly like this one. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He checked the lane behind her twice before stepping back to let her in. "You know who I am," she said. "Everyone knows who you are." He shut the door and bolted it, which she found both encouraging and mildly alarming. "You shouldn't be here. If Sutter's watching the roads out of town, he's not watching the back of his own building." She looked around the small office. Ledgers on shelves, a desk buried in paper, a cot in the corner with a gray blanket folded at its foot. "You live here?" Yes." He moved behind the desk, not to sit at it, just to put something between himself and the conversation. "Mr. Cross prefers I stay close to the records." "I imagine he does." She looked at the shelves. "Are those the originals?" He didn't answer, which was an answer. "Mr. Abilene." She met his eyes across the desk. "I have copies of 31 contracts already. I have a writer who left 2 days ago for Harmon Springs with documentation for the circuit judge. What I don't have is someone who can speak to the internal workings of how these contracts were structured, who gave the orders, and whether the amounts recorded as debt are accurate or inflated." His hands, flat on the desk, twitched slightly. If I were to say anything, "I know what happens," she said quietly. "I know exactly what you're afraid of. I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to tell me the truth, and then let me figure out what to do with it." Abilene stopped, started again. "The debts are inflated, almost all of them. The original amounts were real, but Cross's men charge for transport, for housing, for equipment use, for things that were never part of the original agreement. The interest compounds against inflated principal. Most of these families could never pay it down, even if they worked for him their whole lives, because the way it's structured, they can't." He said it fast, like something he'd been holding in for a long time that came out faster than intended once the seal broke. He knows that. That's the point. That's always been the point. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the north road, a wagon went by. "Will you say that to a judge?" Abilene looked at the ledgers on the shelf, at the cot in the corner, at the desk he'd been sitting behind for 2 years in a room that wasn't much bigger than a generous closet. "Yes," he said. He sounded surprised by himself. She was almost to the door when it opened from the outside. Sutter stepped in. He was not what you expected from a man with his reputation, medium height, graying at the temples, with a quiet, patient face that belonged on a schoolteacher or a country doctor. That was the thing about him that people mentioned afterward, when they talked about Sutter. He never looked like what he was. He looked at Eliza, then at Abilene, then back at Eliza with an expression of mild professional disappointment. "I was wondering when you'd come here," he said. "I should have watched the back." "Yes," she said. "You should have." His hand wasn't on his gun. It didn't need to be. He was a man who'd made a career out of not needing to reach for the gun, of making the space around him feel like the gun was already out. "Mr. Cross would like to speak with you," Sutter said. "I was going to suggest we take a ride." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Miss Hartwell." He said her name gently, patiently, the way you'd correct a child who'd reached for something hot. "The town is full of people who work for Mr. Cross or depend on his business. The man you sent to Harmon Springs is one rider. Mr. Cross has 3 men who left 4 hours ago on fresh horses." He paused to let that settle. "So we can do this in a way that's comfortable, or we can do it in a way that isn't. I genuinely prefer the first." Behind her, she heard Abilene make a small, trapped sound. She went. They didn't take her into town. They took her north, then east on a track she didn't know well, up into the broken country above the valley, where the land tilted and corrugated into ridges and arroyos, and the kind of terrain that discouraged following. Iron Canyon was what the locals called it, a deep cut in the rock where a seasonal creek had spent a few thousand years making itself a channel, with walls 30 feet high in places and the particular acoustics of enclosed stone that made sound behave strangely. Cross was already there when they arrived. He had 6 men with him and a fire going against the canyon wall, which struck her as excessive for a conversation, which told her it wasn't really intended as a conversation. He looked at her when Sutter brought her in, and for the first time she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen on the main street of Black Ridge 2 days ago. not anger. Anger she could have read and worked with. Something more like the flat, calculating focus of a man who'd decided that the cost-benefit of being careful about her had shifted. "Sit down, Miss Hartwell," he said. She sat on the rock he indicated because there was no practical benefit to refusing, and she needed to think. "You've been busy," he said. He was standing across the fire from her, coat off in the canyon heat, looking older than she'd thought him on the street. Tired, maybe. The tiredness of a man who'd built something large and was spending considerable energy keeping it from shifting. "I underestimated you. That was my mistake." "It was," she agreed. His mouth moved, something that wasn't quite a smile. "The documents you've distributed, I know about the copies. I know about the Hale woman. I know about your brother's set." He looked at her steadily. "I also know that your rider isn't going to reach Harmon Springs." Her hands went still in her lap. "Not harmed," he said, reading her face with the ease of a man accustomed to reading faces. "Just delayed. 3 of my men, fresh horses, a different route." He shrugged, like this was logistics, like this was just the normal management of a business problem. "The circuit judge isn't going to receive documentation this week. Next week, perhaps the situation looks different." "The situation," she said, "is 31 contracts that a first-year law student could dismantle." "The situation is a town that works because I keep it working." His voice didn't rise. That was the thing that was frightening about Cross. Everything stayed level, stayed measured, like he'd made his peace with whatever he was a long time ago and didn't need to justify it anymore. 60-some men employed, families fed, the mill running, the roads maintained, the sheriff's office. "The sheriff's office funded by the man breaking the law," she said. "Yes. I'm familiar with how it works." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very young," he said, not unkindly. "You think the truth is a simple thing, that you find it and show it to people and the right thing happens." "No," she said. "I think the truth is an inconvenient thing that has to be made impossible to ignore. That's different." She heard the horses before anyone else did. Later she wouldn't be able to say why. Maybe the canyon's acoustics, the way it bent and focused sound, or maybe just the particular attention of someone who had been waiting and listening for 3 days straight. A low drumming that could have been wind in the rock, except there was no wind. Sutter heard it second. He turned toward the canyon entrance. Cross's men were already moving, spreading out along the canyon walls, hands going to weapons with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Cross himself turned slowly, still unhurried, scanning the canyon rim above them. The rock slide started on the south wall. It wasn't a natural rock slide. She understood that immediately, though it took her a moment to understand the mechanism. A section of the rim had been undermined. She could see it now. The clean lines where rock had been worked loose from below, and whatever had triggered it, a rope cut, a lever released, she'd find out later, brought down a cascade of stone and dust that hit the canyon floor 30 yards south of them and kept coming. A river of rubble that moved across the only clear exit in the space of about 8 seconds. The noise was enormous. The dust came rolling up the canyon in a wave that tasted of chalk and old rock. Cross's men scattered. 2 of them ran toward the blocked exit and stopped, and then ran back. One scrambled for the north end of the canyon, which narrowed to a slot no wider than a man's shoulders. Sutter was very still, very controlled, his gun out now, turning in a circle, reading the canyon rim above. Cross had grabbed Eliza's arm again. She'd known he would. "Tell your man to stop," he said loud over the subsiding rumble, his grip on her arm hard enough to bruise. "He's not my man," she said. "He makes his own decisions." Maddox came down off the south rim on a rope he'd fixed to a juniper up top, fast and not particularly graceful. He hit the canyon floor hard, rolled, came up with the gun out. Behind him, through the settling dust, 2 other shapes came down the north slot. Cal Ware, with a rifle that was too big for him, and the expression of someone who was significantly more frightened than he was letting on. And behind him James Ware, who had apparently made his decision about which side of the odds he was on. 3 against 6, plus Sutter, plus Cross. The math was not comfortable. "Let her go, Cross," Maddox said. His voice carried in the enclosed space, flat and very clear. "You've made a considerable mess," Cross said. He hadn't released Eliza's arm. My men in Harmon Springs. Didn't find me, Maddox said, because I didn't go to Harmon Springs. He kept the gun up, his eyes moving between Sutter and the other men with the constant, exhausting calculation of someone tracking too many things at once. I went to Millhaven. There's a territorial marshal at the Millhaven station, faster than a circuit judge, as it turns out. Something moved in Cross's face for the first time. Something real, something that didn't have the practiced calm of a man in control of his situation. It was just a flicker, and then it was gone. But she saw it. That's a lie, he said. Then you've got nothing to worry about. Maddox took a step forward. Let go of her arm. Sutter moved first. He was fast, genuinely fast, not the kind of fast you performed, but the kind you were. And he had the gun coming up before Maddox had fully registered it. And what happened next happened in the compressed, ugly, not at all cinematic way that real violence happened, which was to say all at once, without courtesy, without anyone clearly in control of the sequence. Eliza dropped her weight straight down. She'd been thinking about it since Cross grabbed her. Not a plan exactly, more like a recognition of geometry, of the fact that if she went down fast enough, his grip would have to release or his shoulder would pop. She hit the canyon floor on her knees on solid rock, and it hurt badly, and she didn't care, and she rolled left, away from him, and her hand found a piece of rubble from the slide that was about the size and weight of a decent melon. She was back up before Cross had finished reacting to the loss of her. She hit him with the rock across the back of the shoulder, not the head. She aimed for the head and missed, because she'd never hit anyone with a rock before, and it turns out aiming is harder when your hands are shaking. But the shoulder connected hard enough that he went down to one knee, and the arm that had been reaching for his gun dropped. Behind her, noise, a shot, and then another, and then Cal Ware's voice saying something she couldn't parse. And the sound of men in an enclosed stone space was overwhelming, echoing off the walls so that it came from everywhere at once. She stood over Cross with the rock still in her hand, and she said very clearly, "Stay down." He looked up at her from his knee. His coat was dusty, and there was blood on his lip from where he'd bitten it when he went down. And for the first time since she'd met him, he looked exactly like what he was, which was a man who had run out of options. "Stay down," she said again. He stayed down. When the dust settled, literally, the canyon dust still sifting through the air, Maddox had Sutter disarmed and against the canyon wall, which had required what looked like a genuinely brutal exchange that had left Maddox bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, and Sutter sitting on the rock with the particular stillness of someone with a headache and no good moves left. 3 of Cross's men had run for the north slot and gotten through it, which meant they were loose in the territory, which was a problem for later. 2 more had dropped their weapons when Cal Ware had turned out to be a surprisingly good shot from the canyon rim where he'd circled during the confusion. James Ware was sitting on a rock, looking like a man who had used up 3 years' worth of adrenaline in 15 minutes. He was shaking slightly. He didn't seem embarrassed about it. Dorian arrived 20 minutes later, which was, in the way of Dorian, both too late to be useful and too soon to be conveniently absent. He came down the north slot on foot, out of breath, with his coat torn where he'd caught it on something, and he stopped when he saw Cross on the ground and Eliza standing over him with a rock, and his face went through 4 or 5 expressions in rapid succession before settling on something that might have been a kind of awed discomfort. "You—" He looked at Maddox, at the canyon, at the rubble blocking the south exit. "How did—" "I told you to stay put," Eliza said. "I know." He looked at Cross again, then at the rock in her hand. I needed to see." He was quiet for a moment. "I needed to see if it worked." The canyon held them all in its stone walls, dust still settling. The fire Cross had built burning down to coals in the afternoon heat. Sutter was silent. Cross was silent. The 2 remaining men had their hands visible and were looking at the ground. Maddox came to stand beside Eliza. He was pressing the back of his hand against the cut above his eye, which was not doing much good. He looked at Cross, then at her. "Marshall gets here tomorrow," he said. "If he rode when I asked him to. And if he didn't? Then we're sitting in a canyon with 6 men who have strong feelings about us until he does." He paused. "We should probably tie some people up." "Probably," she agreed. She set the rock down. Her knees were going to be badly bruised. Her hands were still shaking. She could see them, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and waited for the shaking to stop. It took a while. That was fine. She waited. Marshal Dodd arrived the following afternoon, not the morning Maddox had hoped for, which meant they spent a long, uncomfortable night in Iron Canyon with Cross and Sutter bound at the wrists, and the two remaining men sitting against the north wall under Calware's watchful and slightly nervous supervision. Nobody slept much. The canyon held the heat badly after dark, and the rock was uneven, and Cross spent the first few hours testing the rope at his wrists with the methodical patience of a man who had decided that patience was his best remaining option. He stopped when Maddox noticed and tightened the knot without comment. After that, Cross went quiet and stayed quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd argued. Dorian sat apart from the others for most of the night, on a flat rock near the cooling fire, and stared at nothing in particular. Eliza looked at him once, around midnight, and found him already looking at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not apologetic enough to be remorse, not vacant enough to be nothing. Something in between. The face of a man who was beginning to understand the full weight of what he'd done and finding it heavier than he'd anticipated. She looked away first this time. On purpose. Maddox sat near the canyon entrance through most of the night, which was partly watching for trouble and partly, she suspected, just his nature. The position of a man who'd spent enough years with his back to walls and his eyes on doors that he'd stopped noticing he did it. She brought him coffee from the small pot she'd built the fire back up to make, around 2 a.m, and sat with him for a while in the dark. "You actually went to Millhaven," she said. "I actually went to Millhaven." He drank the coffee without complaint, which told her he was tired enough that standards had dropped. Took most of the first night riding. Marshal Dodd was skeptical, initially. What changed his mind? I told him about the 31 contracts. He told me that was impossible. I showed him the copies. He paused. Then he was less skeptical. Just like that. Not just like that. He had a lot of questions, and some of them were the same question asked 4 different ways, and then he had to send a telegram to the territorial office, and then he had to get his horse ready, and then he had to... Maddox stopped. It took a while. He's thorough. Is that good or bad? Right now I'm hoping it's good. He looked at the canyon entrance, the dark opening of stone against the darker sky. A thorough man doesn't overlook things. Cross's lawyers are going to try to overlook things. We need someone who won't. She thought about that. Cross has lawyers. Cross has 3 lawyers in 2 different cities, according to Abilene. He glanced at her. You didn't think he'd come without them. She hadn't thought that far, honestly. She'd been too focused on the sequence of immediate problems to think clearly about what came after. That was a gap in her planning, and she knew it, and she filed it away with the particular discipline of someone who'd learned to stop punishing herself for what she couldn't control. The ledgers are still in that office, she said. I know. If Cross's people get there before the marshal, I know, he said again. He looked at Cross across the canyon floor, bound and apparently asleep or performing sleep. That's why I sent Cal's cousin up the north slot 2 hours ago to go sit in the records office until morning. She turned to look at him. Cal has a cousin. Apparently everyone in this valley has a cousin. It's a rural thing. He drank more coffee. 16 years old, big as a barn door, said he'd be happy to sit in the office and look threatening at anyone who tried to open the ledger shelves. Despite everything, she almost laughed. Almost. Bishop. Marshal Dodd was a compact, deliberate man of about 55, who wore his authority the way some men wore a good coat. Not showy, just present, something you noticed without being able to say exactly why. He came down the north slot of Iron Canyon with 2 deputies behind him, and stopped at the edge of the scene with his hands on his hips and surveyed it with the expression of a man who had seen a number of things in his career and was adding this one to the list without excessive drama. He looked at Cross first, then Sutter, then Maddox, with particular attention, then Eliza. You're the Hartwell girl, he said. Eliza Hartwell, she said. Yes. Maddox tells me you put this together. Maddox put together the canyon. I put together the paperwork. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but acknowledged the distinction. Then he walked over to Cross and crouched down to look at him at eye level, which was an interesting choice, and said, "Mr. Cross, my name is Marshall Dodd. I have a territorial warrant for your detention pending investigation of fraudulent contract instruments and unlawful labor coercion." He paused. "I'm going to read you the specifics. It's going to take a few minutes." Cross looked at him, then at Eliza, then back at the marshal with the expression of a man working through calculations that were not going the way he'd expected. "I want my lawyers," he said. "You'll have your lawyers," Dodd said pleasantly. "You'll have them in Millhaven, where we're going shortly. Plenty of time to talk to lawyers." He stood up, joints cracking, and turned to his deputies. "Get them up and get them on horses. Carefully." What followed was not quick and not clean. Moving 6 men out of a canyon on a narrow slot trail with bound wrists took time and produced a quantity of complaint that Dodd absorbed with the patience of a man who'd heard it all before. Sutter went quietly, which was somehow more unnerving than the men who argued. Cross went with a controlled fury that had gone internal. He wasn't raging. He wasn't threatening. He was simply present in a way that suggested he was already thinking past this moment to the next one and the one after that. Eliza watched him go and felt something she hadn't expected, which was not satisfaction, but a kind of tired, deflated relief, like setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten what your arms felt like without it. The records office was intact. Cal's cousin, a young man named Boyd, who was indeed large and had clearly taken the assignment seriously, sitting in front of the ledger shelves with a shotgun across his knees and the expression of someone who had told 3 separate people that morning that no, they could not come in, relinquished his post to Marshal Dodd's deputies with visible pride and only minor reluctance. The ledgers were everything Abilene had said they were. Dodd's deputies spent 4 hours going through them with Abilene, who had walked into the records office of his own volition with the slightly dazed quality of a man who'd been holding his breath for 2 years and had just remembered how to exhale, and who answered every question put to him with the precise, detailed recall of someone who had been cataloging information in his head against the possibility of exactly this moment. The numbers were worse than Eliza had known. 31 families in the documents she'd found with Margaret Hale's help. But the internal ledgers showed 47. The 16 she hadn't found were in a separate set of books, a parallel accounting, kept in a lockbox under the floor of the office that Abilene led them to without being asked. 47 families, over 14 months. Total labor extracted at inflated repayment rates that Abilene calculated on a piece of paper in his small, careful handwriting at roughly 3 times the original debt value in most cases. Deputy Walcott arrived at the records office in the early afternoon. He stood in the doorway and looked at the books spread across every surface and at the marshal's men working through them, and at Eliza, who was sitting in the corner with a cup of cold coffee watching it all happen, and he had the grace to look genuinely ashamed. "I didn't know the full extent," he said. "You knew enough," she said. He didn't argue. He stood there for another moment and then went to speak with Marshal Dodd quietly, for a long time, with the posture of a man making a reckoning. The news moved through Black Ridge the way news always moved in Black Ridge, which was faster than anyone planned for. By late afternoon, people were gathering outside the records office and the sheriff's office and the Copper Spur Saloon, not a crowd exactly, more like the individual accumulation of people who'd heard something and come to see if it was true, and then stayed because other people were staying. Margaret Hale was there. James Ware and Cal were there. Tom Garvey from the livery, who'd watched Eliza walk away with Cross's men 4 days ago and done nothing, was there with his hands in his pockets looking at the ground. The thing that happened in the next few hours was not dramatic. Nobody made a speech. Nobody organized anything, exactly. It was more like a gradual, collective exhale, people talking to each other in low voices, people whose situations turned out to have something in common with someone standing next to them, people putting things together that they'd been holding separately. The Rourke family and the Wares and a family named Cassidy that Eliza hadn't known about until Boyd, the large 16-year-old, mentioned his uncle's neighbor, all finding each other in the street outside the building that held the records of what had been done to them. There was anger in it. That was real, and she didn't minimize it. But there was also something else, something quieter and harder to name. The specific relief of people who've been told their problem is their own, their debt is their own, their situation is their own private shame, who have suddenly discovered that it wasn't any of those things. that the machinery was larger than their individual place in it, that they were not stupid or weak. They had just been in the path of something that had been deliberately built to look like law. Eliza stood on the steps of the records office in the late afternoon heat and watched it happening and thought about all the ways it could still go wrong. Cross's lawyers were real. The territorial legal process was slow and expensive and not always just. 3 of Cross's men had gotten out through the canyon and were loose somewhere in the territory. Some of the 47 families were not in Black Ridge. They were spread across the valley, some of them at the processing facility, some of them on Cross's mine operations, and getting word to them and getting them access to what Dodd's investigation found was going to take weeks, possibly months. She was thinking about all of that when Dorian found her. He came up the steps quietly, which wasn't like him. Dorian usually moved through spaces as if announcing his presence, filling rooms on arrival. He stopped beside her, and they both stood looking at the street for a moment without speaking. "Abilene confirmed the debt figures," he said finally. "I heard. The amount I owed, the real amount, before Cross's men inflated it, was $212. He said it like the number had a particular texture. I thought it was closer to $600. I'd been making decisions based on $600. She didn't say anything. "I know that doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "I know it doesn't change what I did. I'm not telling you that to justify it. I'm telling you because I need you to know that I wasn't entirely—" He ran out of words, which was unusual for Dorian. "You weren't entirely calculating," she said. "I know that. You were afraid and you made a terrible decision, and then you kept making it because reversing it would have required admitting what you'd done." She looked at him. "I know who you are, Dorian. I've known you your whole life. Are you going to forgive me?" She turned to look at the street below. The Ware family, Margaret Hale talking to a woman she didn't recognize, Boyd still carrying his shotgun with proprietary satisfaction. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Not today. Maybe not for a while." She paused. "But you came to the canyon, even if you came too late to be useful." "I came to the canyon," he agreed. He sounded like a man accepting a very small credit against a very large debt. "What are you going to do now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Dodd's deputies want statements from everyone who has direct knowledge of Cross's operations. People who were present for the contract signings, people who can speak to the enforcement methods." He paused. "I was present for several things that would be useful to document." "That's dangerous for you." "Yes." He looked at his hands. "It is." She looked at her brother for a long moment. He was 26 years old and had bad habits and worse judgment and had done the worst thing she'd ever known anyone to do to her. He was also still her brother, which was not a thing you could will away, much as there had been moments in the last 4 days when she'd have liked to try. "Then go talk to them," she said. He went. Maddox found her an hour later, sitting on the back steps of the records building with her boots off, looking at her bruised knees, which had gone purple and green and spectacular in the day since Iron Canyon. He sat down beside her without asking, which she'd noticed was his way. He didn't request permission for things he'd already decided were reasonable. He had a clean cloth bandage over the cut above his eyebrow that one of Dodd's deputies had apparently applied with more enthusiasm than skill. It was slightly too wide and slightly crooked, and he looked like he hadn't slept. And he was eating something that appeared to be the tail end of a piece of jerky with the focused attention of a man who'd forgotten to eat for a day and a half. "Dodd's going to need us in Millhaven for the formal proceedings," he said. "I know. That's probably a month out, maybe 2. "I know." He finished the jerky, looked at her knees. "You should get those looked at properly." "I'm going to." She wasn't annoyed by the observation, which surprised her slightly. In her experience, men who gave you practical advice about your own body were generally intolerable. With Maddox, it just landed like a straightforward statement, which was what it was. "Maddox." "Yeah." "What do you do after this?" He looked out at the back lane, the dust and the late light on it. A cat was picking its way along the top of the fence with the dignified indifference of cats everywhere. He seemed to be considering the question in the same way he considered most things, which was carefully and without rushing toward an answer. "I don't usually think much past the current problem," he said. "I've been doing that for a few years now. Ride into a situation, get through it, Ride to the next one. He paused. It's a good way to avoid having to make plans. And now? He was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure I want to ride to the next one right away. He said it like a man testing a thought he hadn't said out loud before. There's work here. The families who are still at Cross's facilities, someone needs to make sure they know what's in those ledgers, that they're not legally bound, that they can leave. He looked at her. That's going to take time, and it's going to take someone the Marshal trusts to be accurate. He trusts you. He tolerates me. It's close enough. He turned slightly toward her. He trusts you. She considered that. The street on the other side of the building was still full of people doing the slow work of figuring out what came next. It was going to take a long time. It was going to be messier than it sounded and slower than it needed to be, and at every step there would be Cross's lawyers arguing process and technicality and the legitimate complexity of territorial law. Some of the 47 families might not get what they were owed. Some things that deserved to be undone might not be undone, or not fully, or not in time to matter to the people they'd happened to. She knew all of that. She'd stopped pretending it would be clean. The house is still mine, she said. Legally. Dorian's name is on the deed, but Cross never completed the transfer. There's no documentation that the family property changed hands. She looked at her bruised knees. It's not much of a house, but it's a place to start. Start what? She thought about the Beaumont family, gone to somewhere unknown with Cross's men helping them load their wagon, the way rumors of their location would need to be followed up carefully, the records that would need to be matched against testimony, the people who still didn't know they were in those ledgers. Something that needs doing, she said. Maddox nodded slowly, not committing, exactly, but not leaving either. The sun was going down behind the ridge west of town, throwing long shadows across Black Ridge that softened everything. The dusty street, the weathered storefronts, the faces of people standing in small groups talking to each other with their hands. It looked in that light like a town in the middle of something rather than at the end of it, which was true. They were nowhere near the end of it. The end of it was months away at minimum and would probably never be as complete as the people standing in that street deserved. But Cross was in custody. The ledgers were documented. 47 families knew their names were in the books, and knew for the first time that the debt they'd been living under was built on paper that wasn't worth what it claimed. That was not everything, but it was not nothing either. Eliza put her boots back on. Her knees complained about the bending, sharply, and she let them complain and did it anyway. I need to eat something, she said. So do I, Maddox said. They went back around to the front of the building, into the street, into the middle of the slow, imperfect, ongoing work of everything that still needed doing. The trial took 11 weeks. That was the part nobody told you about when you imagined justice. The waiting, the paperwork, the specific tedium of legal process grinding forward at its own pace, regardless of what you needed from it. Eliza made the ride to Mill Haven 4 times in those 11 weeks. Twice to give formal testimony, once to review documents with Dodd's office, and once because Cross's lawyers had filed a motion that required her presence, and then spent 3 hours arguing procedural points that had nothing to do with what had actually happened to 47 families in the Black Ridge Valley. She sat through all of it. She answered every question put to her in the flat, precise way she'd learned to answer questions when the person asking had the power to use her words against her, carefully, completely, without elaboration and without flinching. The first time she testified, her hands shook slightly on the table in front of her. She kept them still after that by sheer force of habit, which was the same mechanism she'd used to keep the house running after her mother died, the same one she'd used to walk out her own front door when Cross came to collect her. You found the thing you could control, and you held on to it. Cross's lead lawyer was a man named Ferris from the territorial capital. Expensive suit, the practiced smoothness of someone who made a living finding the technical gap between what was done and what could be proven. He questioned Eliza for 2 hours on her second testimony, circling the same points repeatedly in slightly different language, looking for the place where her account would shift or soften or contradict itself. It didn't. He moved on to Abilene, who was a more anxious witness, but a devastatingly precise one. 14 months of ledger entries lived in the man's memory with a completeness that Ferris clearly hadn't anticipated, and by the end of Abeline's testimony, the lawyer had the look of someone privately revising his fee estimate upward. Dorian testified on a Tuesday in the 7th week. Eliza sat in the back of the proceedings room and watched her brother answer questions about things he had seen and done and chosen not to stop, and she thought about the fact that watching someone be honest about their worst decisions was not the same thing as forgiving them for it. It was its own separate thing, uncomfortable in its own separate way. Dorian was not a good man who had made a mistake. He was a man with a specific collection of weaknesses who had been put in a situation that made the worst of those weaknesses matter enormously. She'd spent a lot of the 11 weeks trying to decide what to do with that distinction, and she hadn't arrived at a clean answer, and she'd started to suspect she wasn't going to. The verdict came on a Wednesday afternoon in late autumn, when the high desert had gone cold and the aspens on the ridge above Millhaven were bare. Harlan Cross, guilty on 6 counts of fraudulent contract instruments, 3 counts of unlawful labor coercion, and 2 counts of conspiracy with public officials. That last one covering Deputy Walcott and the mayor of Black Ridge, a man named Aldrich, who had known about the contracts and done nothing because the mining revenue kept the town solvent, and the town being solvent kept him in office. Walcott lost his badge. Aldrich lost his position. Cross went to the territorial prison in Kellerton for a term that his lawyers would spend the next several years trying to shorten, with varying success. Sutter disappeared before the proceedings concluded. Marshal Dodd was not particularly surprised. Men like Sutter, he told Eliza, had an instinct for when a situation was past saving, and they moved before anyone told them to. He'd likely turned up in another territory under another name, doing variations on the same work for someone else with money and no scruples. That bothered her more than she let on. The idea that the instrument of the thing could just relocate, could just become someone else's problem in a different valley, while the mechanism got rebuilt from scratch somewhere new. She said as much to Maddox one evening in the kitchen of her house on the east side of Black Ridge, while winter was making its early arguments outside the window. "That's always the part that doesn't get fixed," he said. He was sitting at her table with a cup of coffee, doing something to a boot buckle with a small tool, the kind of small domestic repair that she'd noticed he did constantly, things that needed attention that other people let go. You can prosecute the man at the top. You can shut down the machine. The people who operated it just find another machine. That's not a satisfying answer. No. He turned the buckle over. But the alternative is thinking you can fix everything, which is a good way to spend your life disappointed. He looked up. You fix this one, this valley, these 47 families. That's not nothing. I know it's not nothing. You just wish it were more. She looked at the window, the dark outside it, the early stars. I wish Sutter was in a cell, she said. Yes. Me too, he said. Simply, without trying to improve on it. That was something she'd come to value about Maddox in the months since Iron Canyon, his refusal to make things sound better than they were. He was not an optimist. He didn't reframe things into lessons or silver linings or the suggestion that difficulties were secretly gifts. He just looked at what was there and said what he saw. And there was a kind of companionship in that she hadn't known she was missing until it was regularly present. The work of the following months was less dramatic and more exhausting than anything that had come before, which was true of most things worth doing. The 47 families needed their contracts formally voided, which required individual legal proceedings for each one, some straightforward, some complicated by the fact that the original debt, the real debt, before Cross's inflation of it, was still real and still owed to various creditors. Sorting out who owed what to whom, under legitimate terms, took an attorney from the territorial office 3 months of dedicated work and a quantity of paperwork that Eliza sometimes thought could have been used to build a second records office. She coordinated it, not because anyone appointed her to. There was no appointment, no title, no formal structure. It was more that she was the person who knew where all the pieces were, who had talked to every family, who understood both the legal documentation and the human situation behind it, and when people had questions, they came to her because she had answers. She set up a table in the records office 2 days a week, and people came and she helped them understand what the documents said, and what their options were and what they needed to do next. Margaret Hale sat with her most of those days. Her husband had resigned the county clerk position in the aftermath of the proceedings. Not because he'd done anything provably wrong, but because he found he couldn't continue in the role with any self-respect, which Eliza thought was both admirable and slightly inconvenient given how useful his access to the records had been. Margaret had taken over the practical functions of the office unofficially and was considerably better at the job than he had been, which surprised no one who had spent 10 minutes watching her work. "You should get paid for this," Margaret told her one afternoon in January, when the two of them were going through the Cassidy family's documentation and the light outside was thin and cold. "So should you," Eliza said. "The county commission is discussing a formal coordination role for the restitution process." Margaret looked at her over the papers. "I mentioned your name." Eliza looked up. "I don't have legal training. You have 47 case files memorized, and you've sat in on more hours of territorial proceedings in the last 2 months than most practicing attorneys. You can get legal training." Margaret set down her pen. "The county needs someone. The families need someone who already knows the situation. You're not going to tell me you haven't thought about it." She had thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep, which was often, turning over the question of what she was doing and whether it had a future, and whether a future was something she was allowed to want now that the immediate emergency was over. She'd grown up understanding herself as someone who managed things, the house, the money, the endless small logistics of keeping two people alive on not enough. She'd been good at it, and she'd resented it, and she'd done it anyway. What she was doing now was also managing things, also logistics, also the endless small work of keeping people from falling through gaps. But it was different in a way she was still learning to articulate. It was chosen. That was the difference. That was the whole of the difference, and it was enormous. "I'll think about it," she told Margaret. "You've been thinking about it," Margaret said. "Say yes." She said yes. Cowboy opened a farrier operation on the south end of town in February, using the back wages that Dodd's office had calculated Cross owed him and paid out of the seized business assets. His father James took over a portion of the processing facility operation under the new management that the territorial office had installed. Legitimate management with actual wages and actual contracts that said what they meant. James Ware came into Eliza's table day in March and sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "I want to apologize for being slow." "You weren't slow," she said. "You were careful. You had your son to think about." "I should have been faster." He looked at the table. "When you came to my house that day, I should have said yes right then, instead of waiting to see which way it fell." He looked up. "I've been thinking about that." "A lot of people waited," she said, "including people with less reason to than you had. Does that make it better?" She thought about Tom Garvey, who had come to her 2 weeks after the trial and spent 45 excruciating minutes apologizing for standing on the sidewalk and doing nothing, and how she'd had to work to keep her impatience out of her voice because he clearly needed the apology more than she did. She thought about Deputy Walcott, who had submitted a written statement to Dodd's office that was, by all accounts, thorough and accurate, and came about 6 months too late to have prevented any of what had happened. "It doesn't make it better," she said honestly. "But you came. Eventually." She looked at James Ware's tired, weathered face and thought about all the ways fear makes people small, and all the ways that's a human condition and not a character defect, though sometimes it was both simultaneously. Nobody acts the way they wish they would when they're frightened enough. The question is what you do afterward. He nodded, sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "My son's been asking about the position on the commission, the new mine oversight board. He'd be good at it. He thinks he'd be better with you backing his application." She smiled, which still sometimes surprised her, the frequency with which she was doing it these days, like a muscle she hadn't been using that had come back. "Tell him to come talk to me." By the time the aspens came back into leaf that spring, Black Ridge looked the same and felt entirely different, which was the most accurate way she could describe it to someone who hadn't been there before. The storefronts were the same. The dust was the same. The sound the wind made coming off the high flats at night was the same. She'd been hearing it her whole life, but the town had lost that particular atmosphere of held breath, that quality of a place where people moved carefully around things they knew not to mention. People talked in the street now. Not cheerfully, not without friction. It wasn't a town transformed into something easy. It was still a hard place full of people who'd had hard years and were working through the residue of them. But they talked. The Beaumont family came back in April. Clara Beaumont turned up at Eliza's table on a Wednesday morning, looking like a woman who'd spent 6 months being frightened in someone else's house, thinner than she'd been, watchful in the way that takes time to unlearn. Eliza made her coffee and went through the documentation with her and helped her understand that the contract Cross had used to move her family was voided along with the rest, that the house they'd left was still theirs under territorial property law, that the back wages calculation was ongoing, and someone from Dodd's office would be in contact. Clara Beaumont listened to all of it with the focus of someone who'd been prepared for bad news and was having trouble adjusting to the alternative. When Eliza was done, Clara sat quietly for a moment. "Why did you do all this?" she said. "You could have left. After Maddox stepped in on the street that day, you could have found a way out and left." Eliza thought about that question. She'd been asked versions of it several times, in several ways, by people who seemed to genuinely need to understand the motivation because they were trying to figure out what it meant about them that they hadn't done the same. "I didn't have anywhere to go," she said. That was the honest start of it. "And then I got angry. And then I found out it wasn't just me." She paused. "And then it would have cost me something to stop, not in a practical way, in the way where you know who you are and you know what you can and can't live with." Clara Beaumont looked at her. "Most people find they can live with more than they thought." "Yes," Eliza said. "They do. And then they have to live with that too." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The house needs work. 6 months empty. The roof's probably leaked." She straightened in her chair with the particular determination of someone picking up something heavy. "I suppose I'd better get started." Maddox was still in Black Ridge when spring came, which was not something either of them had explicitly planned and which they'd stopped pretending was temporary somewhere around February. He'd taken work helping Dodd's office track the 3 men who'd escaped Iron Canyon through the North Slot. 2 of them had been located in the territory to the east within 2 months, and the third had made it further before being picked up by a marshal in a different jurisdiction entirely. It was useful work, and it suited him, and the marshal's office had started routing certain kinds of difficult situations through him in a way that was becoming incrementally a more formal arrangement. He was not, by his own account or anyone else's, a changed man. He was still quiet in the way that sometimes read as unfriendly until you knew him. He still sat with his back to walls and his eyes on doors. He still maintained things, his horse, his equipment, other people's equipment if they left it near him long enough, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the difference between a thing working and not working was usually just whether someone bothered to pay attention to it. He told her once, in the specific honesty of late evening, when the day's work was done and there was nothing left to do but be where you were, that he hadn't planned to stay anywhere for this long in years. "What changed?" she asked. He looked at his coffee cup, then at her directly, which was something he did when he was being precise. "You," he said. And then, because that was apparently not quite enough, "and the work. And the fact that I stopped feeling like I was moving away from something and started feeling like I was moving towards something. I hadn't felt that in a while." It was not a romantic speech. It was not an elegant declaration. It was a man telling the truth about his own interior in the clumsy, imprecise way that people tell the truth about things they haven't had much practice articulating, and she valued it more for that than she would have valued something polished. "I didn't plan to stay either," she said. "I was trying to survive. And now?" She thought about her table in the records office, the county commission roll, Cal Ware and his farrier shop and the new mine oversight board, and Clara Beaumont and her leaking roof, and James Ware sitting across from her saying, "I should have been faster." She thought about Margaret Hale saying, "Say yes," with the tone of a woman who had been watching another woman talk herself out of things for too long. "Now I'm trying to build something," she said. "I'm not sure what it looks like yet." "That's okay," he said. "Is it?" "Most things worth building start that way." He set down the coffee cup. "You figure it out as you go. You make mistakes. You fix the ones you can." He shrugged. the small, pragmatic shrug of someone who had made peace with uncertainty by deciding it was just the condition of being alive and doing anything. That's all it is. She looked at him and thought about the first time she'd seen him, dusty from the road, unremarkable, stepping down off a gray horse in the middle of a street where 10 people had found something interesting to look at in the middle distance. He hadn't been impressive. He hadn't been certain. He'd just asked a question and waited to see what she'd do. She thought about her father's boots by the door, about what it meant to set something down, not because you'd stopped caring about it, but because carrying it had become the thing itself, the replacement for moving forward, and you had to choose. She thought about Dorian, who was working as a laborer at the new facility management and was, by most accounts, reliable in the way that chastened people sometimes became reliable, carefully, without fanfare, like a man paying back something in the only currency currently available to him. They had dinner together once a month. It was still uncomfortable. She thought it would be uncomfortable for a long time, possibly forever, and she was learning to accept that some repairs took longer than others, and some didn't complete, and that was a true thing about the world and not a failure of effort. She thought about the 18-year-old who had stood in the dirt of this town's main street with a traveling bag and planted her feet. What that girl had wanted was simple, to not be a thing that belonged to someone else, to have her own choices matter, to be, in the most basic sense, a person rather than a piece of property in someone's ledger. She had that now. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost. She had it the way most real things were had, which was imperfectly and by degrees and with the full knowledge that it required maintenance, that nothing you built stayed built without attention, that the people who told you otherwise were selling something. She had it. Outside, the spring wind came off the high flats and moved through the new leaves on the cottonwoods that lined the east side of Black Ridge, and the sound it made was the same sound it had always made, the sound of this place, the sound she'd been hearing since she was a child in this house, with her parents still alive, and the future still just a general idea. It sounded different now. Not better, exactly, just larger, like a sound that had always contained more than she'd known how to hear, and she was only now beginning to understand its full range. She picked up her coffee. Maddox picked up his. Outside the window, Black Ridge went about its evening, imperfect and ongoing, the way towns do, the way everything does when it decides to continue. There was still work tomorrow. There would be work the day after. The 47th family's case was still open. The Mine Oversight Board needed 3 more members and a charter. Clara Beaumont's roof needed fixing. James Ware's son had a meeting with the commission next Thursday that she intended to sit in on. There was always more. She had decided sometime in the last several months that this was not a burden, that more work, more people, more of the slow and imperfect labor of making things better by degrees was not the problem. It was the point, the whole point. You did not get a clean ending. You got the next morning and the next, and the chance to do something with them. She intended to.